On the Forefront Radio, we are discussing Blackbird and the Pacific Ocean War on Afro-Hebrew people. Blackbirding is the coercion of people through deception or kidnapping to work as enslaved persons or poorly paid laborers in countries distant from their native land. The practice took place on a large scale with the taking of people indigenous to the numerous islands in the Pacific Ocean during the 19th and 20th centuries. These blackbirded people were called Kanakas, or South Sea Islanders. They were taken from places such as Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Niue, Easter Island, the Gilbert Islands, Tuvalu, Fiji, and the islands of the Bismarck Archipelago, amongst others. The illegal practice after the abolishments involved captains and crews of the ships involved in the acquisition of these laborers were termed blackbirders. The demand for this kind of cheap labor principally came from European colonists in New South Wales, Queensland, Samoa, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tahiti, Hawaii, and New Zealand, as well as plantations in Peru, Mexico, and Guatemala. Laboring on sugar cane, cotton, and coffee plantations in these lands was the main usage of blackbirded labor, but they were also exploited in other industries. Blackbirding ships began operations in the Pacific from the 1840s, which continued into the 1930s. Deuteronomy 28:68, "And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you." Blackbirders from the Americas sought workers for their haciendas and to mine the guano deposits on the Chincha Islands, while the blackbirding trade organized by colonists in places like Queensland, Fiji, and New Caledonia used the laborers at plantations, particularly those producing sugarcane. Examples of blackbirding outside the South Pacific include the early days of the pearling industry in Western Australia, at Nickel Bay and Broome, where Aboriginal Australians were blackbirded from the surrounding areas. Chinese men were blackbirded from Amoy in the 1840s and 50s to work as unskilled laborers in the pearling, gold, and farming industries. Practices similar to blackbirding continue to the present day. One example is the kidnapping and coercion, often at gunpoint, of indigenous peoples in Central America to work as plantation laborers in the region. They are subjected to poor living conditions, are exposed to heavy pesticide loads, and do hard labor for very little pay. Jeremiah 22:13. "Woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness, and his chambers by wrong, that useth his neighbor's service without wages, and giveth him not for his work." Many Aboriginal and African Australians were also forced into various forms of slavery and unfree labor from colonization. Some Indigenous Australians performed unpaid labor until the 1970s. Pacific Islanders were kidnapped or coerced to come to Australia and work in a practice known as blackbirding. Laborers were also imported from India and China and employed in various degrees of unfree labor. Legal protections varied and were sometimes not enforced, particularly with workers who were effectively forced to work for their employers and would often go unpaid. Australia was held to the Slave Trade Act 1807, as well as the Slavery Abolition Act 1833, which abolished slavery in the British Empire. As the colony of Australia grew and expanded, the evil request for labor also increased. This led to the widespread use of false debt laborers, Pacific Islanders known as Kanakas, who were often forced to work on sugarcane plantations in Queensland under exploitative conditions. This practice, known as blackbirding, involved kidnapping and tricking islanders into forced labor, with many enduring harsh treatment and living conditions. In the mid-19th century, the abolitionist movement gained momentum in Australia, inspired by global efforts to end the transatlantic slave trade. In 1856,
The Australian colonies passed laws that condemned slavery and the forced labor of Indigenous peoples. The transportation of Pacific Islanders to work in Queensland was officially banned in 1901. In 1901, Australia became a federated nation, and the newly formed government took steps to outlaw slavery and indentured labor. The Criminal Code Act, 1995, criminalized slavery, servitude, and forced labor, with penalties for those found guilty of exploiting others in such a manner. Despite the formal abolition of slavery, reports of modern slavery and human trafficking continued to surface in Australia, with cases documented as late as the 1980s. In response, the Australian government has strengthened its laws and policies to combat modern slavery, protect vulnerable populations, and prosecute those involved in such exploitative practices. Follow the Forefront Radio for more.